The echo of gunfire split the mountain air as hooves thundered through the canyon. Find her! She couldn't have gotten far. From her position atop the rocky outcrop, Catherine Morrison watched the men below, her rifle steady in practiced hands. "That was your only warning shot, gentlemen. The next one won't be aimed at the dirt." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1885, and Silver Creek, Montana Territory was a town on the edge of change. My name is Catherine Morrison, though most folks around here just call me the Widow Morrison these days. Funny how quickly a person's whole identity can change with the pull of a trigger. 6 months ago, my life had been different. James Morrison, my husband, was Silver Creek's premier gunsmith. Our shop sat at the edge of town, a testament to his craft and dedication. I'd watch him work, his hands moving with practiced precision over steel and wood, turning ordinary weapons into works of art. "Feel the balance here, Kate," he'd say, placing a newly repaired Winchester in my hands. "Every gun has its own voice. You just need to learn how to listen." I'd smile and absorb his lessons, more out of love for his passion than any real interest. James had insisted on teaching me everything he knew about firearms, their mechanics, their maintenance, their mastery. "Knowledge is the best insurance," he'd always say. Life had a simple rhythm then. Morning meant opening the shop together, the smell of coffee mixing with gun oil and wood shavings. Afternoons brought a steady stream of customers. Ranchers with rifles that needed cleaning, lawmen seeking modifications to their revolvers, hunters looking for custom work. James knew them all by name, knew their stories, their preferences, their needs. I learned too, though I didn't realize how deeply until later. I learned the sound a properly tuned firing pin makes, the way a well-balanced rifle settles into your shoulder like it belongs there. The importance of maintaining your tools with the same care you'd give a prized horse. The trouble arrived wearing a business suit and a snake smile. Harlan Wade was his name, and he came to Silver Creek like a disease, slowly at first, then all at once. His men started buying up businesses, offering protection that nobody asked for, making threats dressed up as friendly advice. We watched as one by one, proud business owners became mere tenants in their own shops. The saloon that had been in the Miller family for 3 generations now belonged to Wade. The general store's shelves suddenly stocked whatever Wade's suppliers sent, at whatever prices they demanded. Those who refused found themselves facing mysterious accidents, broken windows, spoiled inventory, spooked horses. James was one of the first to stand against them. When Wade's right-hand man, Curtis Bolton, came demanding insurance payments, my husband looked him straight in the eye and said, "The only thing this town needs protection from is men like you." That morning in late autumn changed everything. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and James was in his workshop early, finishing a special order. I was preparing breakfast when I heard the shop bell ring. "We're not open yet," I called out. The gunshot that answered changed my world forever. By the time I reached the workshop, James lay motionless on the floor. Bolton stood over him, gun, still smoking. "Terrible accident," he said, with that serpent smile. "Seems your husband was cleaning a loaded weapon. Dangerous mistake." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Something inside me went very quiet and cold. I just stood there, memorizing every detail of Bolton's face. The scar above his left eyebrow, the crooked nose, the way his mouth twitched when he smiled. The town. Marshall ruled it an accident despite the witnesses. Wade's influence reached deep, and everyone knew it. I buried James 3 days later, and the town's sympathy quickly turned to pity, mixed with contempt. They expected me to sell the shop, to move away, to fade into the background like a proper widow should. Instead, I threw myself into the work. Every gun James had been repairing, every custom order he'd promised to complete, I tackled them all. At first, customers were skeptical, but James had taught me well, and soon they realized the quality of work remained the same. Some even started specifically requesting my services, having heard about modifications I'd made to improve various weapons. Weeks passed, and Wade's men grew bolder. They came to the shop regularly, each time offering to buy it for less than it was worth. Each time I refused. They tried different tactics, threats veiled as friendly advice, vandalism disguised as random damage, and finally, open intimidation. But something had changed inside me. Each night I would stay late in the workshop, practicing everything James had taught me. His voice echoed in my memory. "A gun is just a tool, Kate. It's the person holding it that matters." Then came the day that changed everything again. Bolton returned to the shop, flanked by two of his newer recruits, young men with hard eyes and quick tempers, eager to prove themselves to their boss. "Mrs. Morrison," Bolton drawled, "still keeping your husband's little hobby alive, I see. Though your inventory is looking sparse." He wasn't wrong. Many customers had been scared away, but they didn't know I'd been using the quiet time to perfect my skills, working until every weapon in the shop was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. "A woman alone in these parts. It's not safe," Bolton continued, picking up a revolver. "Accidents happen all the time, just like with poor James." The cold inside me crystallized into something harder. Without looking up, I said, "You know what James used to say about accidents, Mr. Bolton?" I took the revolver from his hands, checking its cylinder with practiced ease. He said they only happen when people don't respect the weapons they're handling. Before Bolton could blink, I had the revolver pointed squarely at his chest. His men reached for their guns, but Bolton waved them off, a bemused smile playing at his lips. "Well, well. The widow's got some spirit after all, but do you actually know how to use that thing?" I answered by turning slightly and firing through the open workshop door. The shot echoed through the room, followed by the distinct sound of a tin can being knocked off the fence post 60 yards away. Bolton's smile faltered. "Lucky shot." "Luck has nothing to do with it, Mr. Bolton. James taught me everything he knew. Now I believe our business is concluded for the day." That night, as I cleaned James's favorite revolver, the one he'd called Truth Teller, I realized something fundamental had shifted. The grieving widow they thought they knew had died with James. In her place stood someone new, someone forged in the fire of necessity and tempered by determination. Wade and his men had no idea what they'd created when they decided to target a simple gunsmith's widow. But they were about to find out. Golden light painted the mountains as I made my way toward Miller's old barn. The mysterious note in my pocket felt heavy with promise, or perhaps threat. Not everyone has forgotten what happened to James. Some of us want to help. Miller's barn at sunset. I'd spent the day debating whether to come, but hope had won out over caution. Still, James's voice echoed in my head. Always be prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. Truth Teller rode snug against my hip, hidden beneath my coat, and a Winchester rested in an old grain sack over my shoulder. Fresh hoofprints marked the earth around the barn. Several horses had been here recently. I circled the structure once, noting the positions of doors and windows, counting shadows and listening for movement. "Mrs. Morrison?" The whisper came from Michael Henderson, one of the younger ranch hands, who'd frequented our shop. Inside, quickly, oil lamps illuminated 5 faces I knew well. Michael, 2 ranch hands from neighboring spreads, and Thomas Wright, the telegraph operator, with his wife Mary. All people who'd been kind to me, though, never close enough to call friends. "We've been gathering evidence," Michael said, his young face earnest in the lamplight. "About James, about Wade, about everything that's happening to our town. But we needed someone with the courage to act on it. Someone they wouldn't suspect." Thomas Wright cleared his throat. Being the telegraph operator, I see all the messages between Wade and his associates in other territories. I've been keeping copies. His wife pulled a thick envelope from her shawl. Messages about similar accidents in other towns, about shipments that don't match any legitimate business, about people who stood up to Wade and then disappeared. We need someone who can get close enough to find concrete proof, Mary explained. Someone who can handle themselves if things go wrong. She held out the envelope. These telegrams are just the start. We need more. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I studied their faces in the lamplight, remembering how James used to say you could tell a person's character by the way they handled a gun, with respect, with fear, or with dangerous overconfidence. These people showed the same kind of resolve. I'd seen in my husband's eyes the day he refused Wade's demands. Why me? Because they've already underestimated you once, Michael said. They think you're just a grieving widow trying to keep her husband's shop alive. They won't expect you to be a threat. I thought of James, of our shop, of everything Wade and his men had taken from this town. I'll need to know everything you've learned about their operation, their habits, their weaknesses, their plans. Thomas spread a rough map on a hay bale. Wade's main office is next to the bank. That's where Bolton and the others meet every Friday night. Something big is coming. The telegrams have been increasing lately. Getting into that office won't be easy, I said, studying the map. No, Michael agreed, but we've got people willing to help. Shopkeepers who see everything, ranch hands who can create diversions. We just need someone with the skills to lead the way. Over the next hour, they shared everything they knew. How Wade's operation spread across 3 territories. How he used the bank to launder money from illegal operations. How his men maintained their control through strategic violence and calculated mercy. The next few days passed in a careful dance of normalcy and secret preparation. I kept the shop open as usual, but now every customer represented potential information. I watched Wade's men's patterns, when they visited certain businesses, which saloons they frequented, who they talked to. Sarah Cooper, the school teacher who'd been kind to me after James's death, noticed the change. "You seem different lately," she said one afternoon, watching me repair a rancher's rifle. "More focused." "Just trying to keep the business going," I replied, giving her my best attempt at a weary smile. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Kate, I'm worried about you. The way you stood up to Bolton. People are talking." "Sarah, do you remember what you told me after James died? You said that grief either breaks us or makes us stronger." "I remember." "Well, I've made my choice about which it's going to be." I picked up the rifle again, checking its sights with practiced care. James taught me everything he knew about guns because he believed knowledge was power. He believed in doing things the right way, in standing up for what's right, and getting killed for it, Sarah said softly. The words stung, but I kept my voice steady. "Maybe, but there are some things worth dying for, and even more worth living for." That evening, as I closed the shop, Curtis Bolton rode past slowly. He tipped his hat with mock courtesy, but his eyes were cold and calculating. I met his gaze with the tired resignation he would expect from a widow struggling to maintain her husband's business. But inside, my mind was already working through the next steps of our plan. Tomorrow, Michael would create a distraction at the saloon, while Mary Wright helped me get close to Wade's office. We would begin gathering the evidence we needed, piece by piece, building our case against the men who had taken so much from all of us. James had always said that justice was like a well-made gun. It required patience, precision, and the courage to pull the trigger when the time was right. As I watched Bolton ride away, I silently thanked my husband for teaching me both. That night, I added another entry to the journal I'd been keeping since James's death. Not the grief-stricken words of a widow, but detailed observations about Wade's operation, maps of their movements, notes about their habits and weaknesses. Each page brought me closer to understanding not just what they'd done, but how to stop them. The last thing I wrote that night was something James used to say. A good shot isn't about the gun. It's about knowing your target, understanding the distance, and being willing to take responsibility for what happens when you pull that trigger. Wade and his men had taught me about distance when they killed James. Now I was learning about targets. Soon, very soon, they would learn about responsibility. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the shop. Marshal Reed entered just as I was finishing with my first customer of the day. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, removing his hat. "We need to talk about your recent activities." I continued organizing my workbench, laying out tools with deliberate care. "What activities would those be, Marshal?" "People are talking about your confrontation with Bolton. Some say you threatened him. Is that what they're saying?" I kept my voice neutral. "Interesting how threats work in this town. When Wade's men do it, it's business. When I defend myself, it's a problem." Reed shifted uncomfortably. "Kate, I knew your husband. James was a good man, but his stubbornness got him killed?" I finished, finally looking up. "Is that what you're going to say, Marshal? That he brought it on himself by not giving in to criminals?" "That's not what I—" "Then what exactly are you saying?" I set down my tools and faced him fully. "Because, from where I stand, the law in this town seems to work differently, depending on who's breaking it." Reed's face hardened. "Be careful, Mrs. Morrison. I'd hate to see anything happen to you." "Like what happened to James?" I asked softly. "Another accident that you won't investigate?" He replaced his hat, jaw tight. "This is your only warning, Kate. Don't make enemies you can't handle." After he left, I pulled out James's old ledger. Behind the business accounts, I'd started keeping track of everyone in town, who was loyal to Wade, who might be willing to help, who was simply trying to stay neutral. Reed's name moved firmly into the first column. Later that afternoon, Thomas Wright slipped me another telegram he'd intercepted. Wade was planning something big, a shipment coming in that would solve their problems permanently. The timing matched with rumors about a large gold transfer through the bank, but something about it felt wrong. I shared my concerns with the group when we met again that evening, this time in the back room of Mary Wright's dressmaking shop. "Wade doesn't need more money," I explained. "He's got plenty from his legitimate businesses and his protection rackets. This is something else. Weapons, maybe?" Michael suggested. "There's been talk about troubles with the Indian tribes up north." "Starting a war would be good for business," one of the ranch hands, Cooper, added grimly. "Especially if Wade's supplying." Both sides, the pieces started falling into place. Wade wasn't just trying to control our town. He was positioning himself to profit from regional conflict. The weapons knowledge James had given me suddenly took on new importance. "We need to move faster," I said. "If Wade's bringing in illegal weapons, that's something even his bought lawmen can't ignore. But we need proof." "The shipment's coming in 3 days," Thomas reported. "Through Miller's Pass." "Then that's where we'll be," I decided. "But first, we need to know exactly what's in Wade's office. Those records could give us everything we need." Mary pulled out a rough sketch of the building's interior. "The cleaning woman who works there is sympathetic to us. She says Wade keeps his most important papers in a safe behind his desk." "Can she get to it?" Mary shook her head. "It's always locked, and Bolton carries the only key." I thought about the way Bolton wore his keyring, how it jingled when he walked. "Then we'll have to get creative. Michael, how's your riding?" "Best in 3 countries. "Why?" "Because tomorrow you're going to start a stampede." I began outlining the plan, watching their faces shift from doubt to understanding to determination. Later that night, as I cleaned James's revolvers and checked my ammunition supplies. I remembered something else he used to say. The most dangerous shot isn't the first one. It's the one you take when everything's gone wrong and you have to improvise. I had a feeling we'd be doing plenty of improvising in the days to come. But James had taught me more than just how to shoot. He taught me how to think, how to plan, how to see the angles others might miss. Wade and his men thought they were dealing with a simple widow, someone they could bully or buy off. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The morning of our plan dawned cold and clear. I watched the sun rise through the workshop window, methodically checking my weapons one final time. James's voice echoed in my memory. A gun is only as reliable as the person maintaining it. Michael's signal would come at precisely 10 o'clock, when Wade's men would be making their morning rounds. I'd spent weeks watching their patterns, noting how Bolton always stopped at the saloon for his morning whiskey, how the younger thugs liked to harass the shopkeepers for their protection money. Sarah Cooper entered the shop just as I was loading the last revolver. Her eyes widened at the array of weapons on my workbench. "Planning for trouble?" she asked quietly. "Just cleaning inventory," I replied, but we both knew it was a lie. "Kate," she hesitated. "There are rumors. People say Wade's bringing in something big through Miller's Pass. Whatever you're planning, sometimes it's better not to know things, Sarah." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Two strangers checked into the hotel last night. The kind that carry their guns like they know how to use them. Wade's bringing in more muscle." I nodded, grateful for the information while trying not to show it. "Thank you for telling me. Just be careful. This town needs you alive." "This town needs someone to stand up to Wade," I corrected. "James tried, and they killed him for it, but they made a mistake when they left me alive." The distant sound of panicked cattle reached us before Sarah could respond. "Right on schedule. What's happening?" Sarah moved to the window. "Looks like someone spooked the Henderson herd," I said calmly, sliding Truth Teller into its holster. "You should probably head home. Streets might not be safe with stampeding cattle." As if on cue, the thunder of hooves grew louder. People began shouting in the street, and I heard Wade's men yelling as they tried to respond to the chaos. Through the window, I watched Bolton and his thugs ride past, heading toward the commotion. "Go home, Sarah," I repeated firmly. "And maybe stay there for a while." She gave me one last worried look before hurrying out. I waited exactly 3 minutes, then moved into action. The cattle would keep Wade's men busy for at least 15 minutes. Michael had promised to lead them on. Quite a chase. That gave me a narrow window to get what we needed. Wade's office sat quiet and seemingly deserted. Mary Wright would be keeping watch from her shop across the street, ready to signal if anyone approached. I slipped in through the back door, using the key we'd obtained from the cleaner. The office smelled of tobacco and leather, with a faint undertone of gun oil. Heavy curtains blocked most of the morning light, leaving the room in shadow. I moved quickly to the massive desk that dominated the space, my fingers finding the hidden latch. Exactly where Mary's informant had described it. The safe swung open silently, revealing stacks of papers and ledgers. I began photographing them with the small camera Thomas had provided, working as fast as I dared while still ensuring each image would be clear. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun, Truth Teller clearing its holster smoothly, only to find myself facing one of the strangers Sarah had mentioned. He was tall, weathered, with eyes that had seen too much violence. "Mrs. Morrison," he said calmly, his own revolver trained steadily on my chest. "Mr. Wade said you might try something like this." "Did he?" I kept my voice steady, mind racing through options. "Funny how he seems to know so much about what I might do. He knows a lot of things, like how your husband really died." That made me hesitate just for a moment. The stranger saw it and smiled slightly. "Put the gun down, ma'am. Mr. Wade would like to talk to you." I bet he would. My finger tightened on the trigger. But I don't think I'm interested in anything he has to say, even if it's about who really gave the order to kill James Morrison. Before I could respond, shots erupted from the street. The stranger's head turned instinctively toward the sound. A rookie mistake James would have berated. I didn't waste the opportunity. My first shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him back. His return fire went wide as he stumbled, giving me the chance to dive behind the desk. More shots splintered the wood around me. "You're good," he called out, pain evident in his voice. "But you're also trapped. Wade's men will be back any minute." "Maybe," I replied, listening to his movement, "but you'll be dead before they get here." He laughed, a harsh sound. "You sure about that, Widow? Are you ready to kill a man in cold blood?" "Nothing cold about it," I said, remembering James's lessons about talking while shooting. Keep them distracted, keep them thinking about anything. But their next move: "You work for the man who murdered my husband. That makes this self-defense. Lady, you don't know the first thing about what really happened to your husband." I heard him shifting position, trying to get a better angle. "Then why don't you tell me? Put down the gun, come with me to see Wade, and you'll learn everything." "I've got a counter-offer," I said, calculating angles in my head. "You drop your gun, tell me what you know, and I let you walk out of here." More shots rang out from the street, closer now. The stranger cursed softly. "Sounds like your friends are keeping my colleagues busy," he said. "But they can't hold them off forever." "They don't need to." I'd identified the creak in the floorboard that would tell me exactly where he was standing. "They just need to keep them busy long enough." "For what?" "For this." I fired through the desk, the bullet finding the weak point in the floorboard I'd been listening for. The wood splintered with a crack, and I heard him stumble. In that moment, I rolled out from behind the desk, coming up in a shooting stance just as James had taught me. The stranger was good. His gun was already tracking toward me even as he fought for balance. But James had always said that the difference between living and dying often came down to who had practiced more. I'd practiced this shot thousands of times. Truth Teller roared once more, and the stranger's gun clattered to the floor as he clutched. His right hand, blood seeping between his fingers. "That's 2 wounds you can survive," I said, keeping my gun trained on him. "The next one won't be so forgiving. Now tell me what you know about James." "You're making a mistake," he gasped. "Wade's not who you think. Your husband—" The window exploded inward as Bolton crashed through it, rolling to his feet with his gun already drawn. I spun to face him, but the stranger lunged, despite his wounds, catching my arm. The shot went wide. Bolton's bullet caught me in the shoulder, the impact spinning me back against the desk. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but James's voice in my head kept me focused. "Pain is just information. Use it." I let myself fall, using the desk for cover again. Bolton's laugh was ugly. "Not so brave now, are you, Widow? Drop the gun, or the next one goes somewhere more permanent." I heard him approach, boots crunching on broken glass. The stranger was breathing heavily somewhere to my left. "It's over, Mrs. Morrison," Bolton said. "But if you surrender now, maybe. Mr. Wade will still be willing to talk." "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the pain. "About how you murdered my husband?" "About how your husband was working for us." The words hit harder than the bullet had. "You're lying, am I?" Bolton was closer now. "Why do you think he taught you so much about guns? He knew what was coming. He was trying to prepare you. James would never work for Wade." "Everyone works for Mr. Wade eventually," the stranger added. "One way or another. Your husband just figured it out sooner than most." My mind raced through memories. James's insistence on teaching me everything he knew, the late-night visitors he'd turn away, the worried looks when he thought I wasn't watching. "No," I said firmly, pushing away doubt. "James stood against Wade. That's why you killed him." "We killed him because he changed his mind," Bolton said. "Got cold feet about the weapons shipment. Decided he couldn't live with what he'd helped set up. Wade doesn't tolerate that kind of disloyalty." The world seemed to tilt sideways. But through the chaos in my mind, one of James's lessons surfaced. When everything goes wrong, when nothing makes sense, focus on what you know is true. What did I know was true? I knew James had taught me everything about guns for a reason. I knew Wade was bringing in weapons to start a war. I knew Bolton was getting closer, expecting me to be too shocked to act. I also knew exactly how many shots Bolton had fired and how many I had left. "Come on out, Mrs. Morrison," Bolton called. "Let's talk about this civilized-like." "You want to talk?" I shifted slightly, getting my feet under me. "Let's talk about the real reason you killed James." "Oh, and what's that?" "Because he was better than you." I was tense, ready, better at everything. Bolton's laugh was cut short as I came up firing. The first shot caught him in the leg, dropping him to one knee. The second knocked his gun away. The third shot never came. The stranger tackled me from behind, sending us both crashing into Wade's desk. Truth-teller skittered across the floor. "You don't understand," the stranger grunted as we struggled. "Wade isn't the real enemy here." "Then who is?" I drove my elbow back, catching him in his wounded shoulder. His grip loosened. "The same people your husband was trying to stop." Bolton's gun roared, and the stranger's weight suddenly went limp. I rolled away as Bolton fired again, the bullet splintering the floor where I'd been. "Enough games," Bolton snarled, blood soaking his pant leg. "Time to join your husband, widow." The world slowed to a crawl. James used to say that in moments of true danger, time itself seems to change. Now I understood what he meant. I could see everything with crystal clarity. The blood dripping from Bolton's leg, the dead stranger's unseeing eyes. Truth-teller, lying just feet away near the broken window. A crash from outside drew Bolton's attention for a split second. It was all I needed. I dove for my gun, just as his shot splintered the floorboards where I'd been. Rolling to my feet, I came up firing. The first shot caught him in his good leg. As he stumbled, my second shot sent his gun spinning away. Bolton fell hard, cursing through gritted teeth. "That's for threatening me," I said coldly, keeping Truth-teller trained on him. "Now tell me the truth about James." "You'll have to ask." "Wade?" Bolton gasped. "I just follow orders." "Not anymore." I moved closer, being careful to stay out of his reach. James would never have worked for Wade. I knew my husband. "Did you?" Bolton's smile was bloody. "Did you know about his trips to Fort Harrison? About military contacts? About the—" A shotgun blast from the doorway cut him off. I dove behind the remains of Wade's desk as more shots filled the room. Through the chaos, I heard heavy boots on the wooden floor. "Mrs. Morrison," a voice called out, one of Wade's new men. "Come out now, and Mr. Wade says you can live. Stay hiding, and we burn this place down with you in it." I checked my ammunition. 3 shots left in Truth-teller. The Winchester in my bag was out of reach. Outside, I could hear more of Wade's men taking positions. "Last chance, widow." What's it going to be? I thought of James, of all his lessons about guns and survival. But mostly I thought about what he'd said about choice. That the most important. "Shots are the ones you choose not to take." "All right," I called back. "I'm coming out. Don't shoot. Slide your gun out first." I took Truth-teller's grips in my hand one last time, feeling the familiar weight. "Sorry, James," I whispered. Then I slid it across the floor. "Stand up. Hands where we can see them." I rose slowly, hands raised. 4 men had entered the office, all with guns trained on me. Bolton lay unconscious or dead by the window. The stranger's body hadn't moved. "Check her for other weapons," the leader ordered. As one of the men approached, I kept my face carefully blank. Let them think they'd won. Let them think the widow had given up. They didn't know about the derringer strapped to my ankle, the one James had given me on our first anniversary. "A lady should always have one last surprise," he'd said with a wink. They didn't know about Michael and the others, who would be implementing the second part of our plan right now. Most importantly, they didn't know what I'd discovered in Wade's safe before the stranger interrupted. Proof not just of weapons smuggling, but of something much bigger. Something that explained why Wade had really come to Silver Creek, and why James had died trying to stop him. "Mr. Wade wants to see you," the leader said as his man finished searching for me. "Time to clear up some misconceptions about your late Husband, lead the way, I said quietly, playing the defeated widow. As they marched me out of the office, I caught a glimpse of Mary Wright watching from her shop window. She gave me the briefest of nods. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Wade and his men thought they were finally catching the troublesome widow. They didn't realize they were walking into a trap of our own making. James had taught me more than just how to shoot. He'd taught me how to think, like someone who meant to survive. Wade's men marched me through the back streets of Silver Creek, avoiding the main thoroughfare where the aftermath of Michael's cattle distraction still played out. My shoulder throbbed where Bolton's bullet had grazed me, but I forced myself to look defeated, broken. Let them think they'd won. Harlan Wade's mansion stood on the outskirts of town, a monument to wealth built on others' misery. I'd never been this close to it before, though James had once pointed it out with an expression I now realized had been more than just disapproval. They led me into a study that smelled of leather and expensive tobacco. Wade sat behind a massive desk, looking exactly as I remembered from the day he'd first arrived in Silver Creek. Elegant suit, perfectly trimmed silver hair, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, rising, "please sit. We have much to discuss." "I prefer to stand." "As you wish." He gestured and his men withdrew, leaving us alone. "I must say, you've caused quite a bit of trouble for a grieving widow, and you've caused quite a bit of misery for a legitimate businessman." He laughed, the sound surprisingly genuine. "You really don't know, do you? James never told you what he was really doing? I know my husband was an honest man who died standing up to you. Your husband was many things, Mrs. Morrison, but honest might be stretching the truth." Wade opened a drawer and withdrew a familiar leather journal. My heart stopped. It was James's personal notebook, the one that had gone missing after his death. "Where did you get that?" James gave it to me, of course, along with detailed reports about military movements, fort defenses, and ammunition supplies. Wade's smile turned cold. "Your husband was one of my most valuable agents." "You're lying." He opened the journal to a marked page. His handwriting was quite distinctive. Those loops in his Y's, the way he crossed his T's, I believe you'd recognize it anywhere. He held out the journal. My hands shook as I took it, but not from fear. James had indeed had distinctive handwriting, which was why I recognized instantly that this wasn't it. A good forgery, but not perfect. "Quite detailed reports," Wade continued. "Fort locations, patrol schedules, weapons inventories, everything needed to plan a proper uprising." I kept my expression neutral as pieces clicked into place. "The weapons. Shipment coming through Miller's Pass. You're not just arming criminals, you're planning to arm the tribes against the army." "Very good. James said you were clever." Wade poured himself a drink. "A proper war would be very profitable for certain interests. Weapons, supplies, protective services for terrified settlers, and James was helping you plan this, until he developed a conscience." Wade's voice hardened. "Started talking about innocent lives and doing the right thing, as if right and wrong matter when there's real power at stake." I turned a page in the journal, recognizing more subtle differences from James's real writing. "So you had him killed." Bolton was perhaps too enthusiastic in his methods, but yes, we couldn't risk James warning the authorities. Wade studied me over his glass. "But you've shown remarkable skill and determination, the same qualities that made your husband valuable. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you survival, money, power, everything James was too weak to take." I closed the journal carefully. "And if I refuse?" "Then sadly, Silver Creek will suffer another tragic accident. Perhaps a fire that spreads from that quaint little gunsmith shop to the surrounding businesses." His smile never wavered. "So many wooden buildings, so very flammable. A knock at the door interrupted us. One of Wade's men entered, whispering, "Something urgent." Wade's expression darkened. "It seems we have an interruption to deal with. Think about my offer, Mrs. Morrison. I'll return shortly." The moment the door closed, I moved into action. While they'd searched me for weapons, they hadn't searched carefully enough. The hairpin I always wore, another of James's gifts, was actually a slim lockpick. I quickly found what I was looking for in Wade's desk: more journals, these ones genuine, military documents, maps marked with planned attack points, and most importantly, telegrams proving Wade's connections to arms dealers and corrupt officials across 3 territories. The sound of arguing reached me from somewhere in the house. Our diversion was working. Thomas Wright had sent a false telegram about problems at one of Wade's warehouses, backed up by real smoke signals from fires Michael and the others had set. I photographed everything I could with the tiny camera. Hidden in my brooch, another gift from our growing network of allies. James had taught me to be thorough, and now I understood why. Boots in the hallway warned me someone was coming. I quickly replaced everything, moving back to where Wade had left me. The door opened to reveal Bolton, pale but very much alive, his legs crudely bandaged. "Boss wants you guarded," he growled, limping to a chair. "No more tricks." Wouldn't dream of it. We sat in tense silence as minutes crawled by. Bolton kept his gun trained on me, but his hand shook slightly from blood loss. One good rush might overwhelm him. But then what? The house was full of Wade's men. New sounds filtered in from outside, horses approaching fast, men shouting. Bolton straightened, alert despite his wounds. "What did you do?" he demanded. "Me? I've been right here." A gunshot echoed from somewhere in the house, then another. Bolton stood, moving to the window while keeping his gun pointed at me. "Son of a—" He turned sharply. "On your feet. We're moving." "Having trouble at the warehouse?" I asked innocently. His eyes narrowed. "This was a setup. You really should have searched for me better." He raised his gun just as the window exploded inward. Michael Henderson crashed through in a shower of glass, tackling Bolton before he could fire. They went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. Didn't hesitate. The derringer strapped to my ankle came smoothly into my hand, just as James had drilled me countless times. 2 shots, small caliber, but at this range it didn't matter. Bolton went still. "Perfect timing," I told Michael, as I helped him up. "Sarah said they brought you here. Figured you could use some help." He grinned despite the cuts from the window. "Wade's men are scattered between here and the warehouse. Thomas's telegram worked perfectly. And the real shipment. Cooper and the others are in position at Miller's Pass. But we need to hurry. Wade's bound to figure out the warehouse fire is a diversion." I grabbed James's journal from Wade's desk. "One last thing. We need to get to the telegraph office. I have evidence that needs to reach the territorial marshal." "Kate," Michael hesitated, "there's something else you should know. When we were setting up the warehouse diversion, we found documents about James." My heart clenched. Wade already tried to convince me James was working for him. He wasn't. He was working for the territorial marshal's office, deep undercover, gathering evidence about Wade's operation. The world tilted sideways as every interaction with James took on new meaning. His insistence on teaching me everything he knew, the late-night visitors, the worry in his eyes that last morning. "The marshal's office abandoned him," Michael continued. "When things got hot, they pulled out their other agents but left James in place. Said he was in too deep to extract without compromising the whole operation. So he was going to expose Wade himself," I whispered. "That's why they killed him." "Kate, I'm sorry. We just found out." More gunshots from downstairs interrupted. Him, running feet, approached in the hallway. "Tell me the rest later," I said, checking the Derringer's empty chambers. "Right now, we need to move. Give me your spare gun." He handed over a revolver. Not truth-teller, but it would do. "Like old times?" he asked with a grim smile. I thought of James, of everything he'd sacrificed trying to bring Wade down. Of everything. He'd taught me, preparing me for exactly this moment. "No," I replied, moving to the door. "This time we will finish it." We crept into the hallway, staying close to the walls. Shouts and gunfire echoed from different parts of the mansion, creating a chaotic symphony of violence. James's voice whispered in my memory. "Chaos is both friend and enemy. It hides you, but it also hides those hunting you." "Which way?" Michael whispered. A floorboard creaked above us. I pulled him into an alcove just as two of Wade's men rushed past, heading toward the commotion at the front of the house. "Backstairs," I murmured. "Wade will have an escape route, probably through the kitchen." We found the servants' staircase and descended carefully. The kitchen was empty, signs of hastily abandoned work everywhere, bread half-kneaded, coffee still percolating on the stove. "There," Michael pointed to a heavy door, partially hidden behind shelving. "Has to be the cellar." Before we could reach it, the main kitchen door burst open. Wade stood there, his elegant suit now disheveled, his silver hair wild. Two guards flanked him, guns raised. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, his cultured voice strained. "I really had hoped we could come to an arrangement, like the arrangement you had with James. I kept my gun trained on him, using him to gather intelligence, then killing him when he discovered your real plans. Your husband was an idealist. He thought he could play both sides, feed information to the marshal's office while maintaining his cover with us." Wade's smile turned cruel. He didn't understand that in this territory, the law works for me. "Not anymore," I said. "We have proof of everything. The weapons shipments, the planned uprising, your connections to corrupt officials." "Proof?" Wade laughed. "My dear, who do you think will believe a widow and a ranch hand over a respected businessman? I own judges in 3 territories. I have senators in my pocket. Maybe." I shifted slightly, seeing Michael do the same in my peripheral vision. "But how many of them will stand by you when they learn you're planning to arm hostile tribes? When settlers start dying, when forts fall, when war spreads across the territory, how many of your friends will take that fall with you?" Wade's confidence wavered for just a moment. "An interesting theory. Shame you won't live to test it." "Are you sure about that?" I asked, letting my aim drift slightly. "Your men's hands are shaking. They've been fighting. They're tired. I only need 1 shot, and my men only need to hit your friend," Wade countered. "How fast are you, really?" "Fast enough." I smiled, channeling James's quiet confidence. "Want to bet your life on it?" Wade studied me, really looked at me for the first time. "You know, I underestimated you, just like I underestimated James. He talked about you, in our meetings, said you were stronger than anyone knew." "Stop talking about my husband. He was trying to protect you. Everything he did, the training, the lessons, the preparations. Oh, it was all for you. He knew someday someone would have to stand against me. He just didn't think it would be his widow." A crash from above made everyone jump. Wade's men glanced up instinctively. It was all the opening we needed. I fired at the lantern hanging above them as Michael threw a sack of flour from the counter. The combination of shattered glass, burning oil, and flour dust created a blinding cloud. Wade and his men fired blindly as we dove in opposite directions. The kitchen erupted into chaos. Through the haze, I caught glimpses of movement, muzzle, flashes, shadows dancing in the lantern's dying light. I rolled behind a heavy cabinet, ears ringing from the gunfire in the enclosed space. A figure loomed through the flour dust. I fired without hesitation. One of Wade's men went down clutching his chest. "Catherine," Wade's voice called out, using my full name for the first time. "Think about what you're doing. I can still make this right." "Like you made it right with James?" I moved positions, trying to track his voice. "James made his choice, but you're different, stronger, smarter. Join me, and together we can—" Michael's shot cut him off. Wade stumbled into view, clutching his arm. His remaining guard fired back, forcing Michael to duck behind an overturned table. I had a clear shot at Wade. My finger tightened on the trigger. "Kate!" Michael's warning came just as the other guard emerged from the dust behind me. I spun, firing instinctively. He dropped, but Wade used the distraction to dash through the cellar door. "After him!" I shouted, already moving. The cellar steps descended into darkness, the only light coming from a lamp Wade must have grabbed in his flight. We followed the bobbing light through a maze of wine racks and storage crates. "There's a tunnel," Michael panted as we ran. The clerk at the land office said the mansion was built over old mining passages. Wade's light disappeared around a corner. When we reached it, we found ourselves facing a fork in the tunnel. "Split up?" Michael asked. I shook my head. "He wants to separate us, make us easier targets." I closed my eyes, listening intently like James had taught me. There, a faint dragging sound came from the left passage, Wade's injured arm brushing the wall. "Together," I said. Michael nodded. "Together." We moved forward into the darkness, following the sound of Wade's desperate flight. The truth about James, about everything, was just ahead, and this time there would be no escape. The mining tunnel seemed to breathe around us, ancient timbers creaking in the darkness. Our footsteps echoed despite our attempts at stealth, and the air grew thicker with each step deeper into the earth. "Watch your head," Michael whispered, ducking under a low beam. These tunnels were dug for Chinese laborers, smaller men. I nodded, remembering James's stories about Silver Creek's mining days. He'd been fascinated by the town's history, always exploring, always learning. Now, I wondered how much of that exploration had been about his undercover work. Wade's lamp. Light had vanished, but we could hear him ahead, breathing hard, stumbling in the dark. His injured arm would be slowing him down. "He's bleeding," Michael observed quietly, pointing to dark drops on the packed earth floor. "Can't run much longer." A shot rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space. Splinters flew from a support. "Beam near my head." "That's close enough," Wade's voice echoed back to us. "I've got 6 shots and nothing left to lose." 5 shots now," I called back. "And you're losing blood. How's your aim, Wade?" Another shot answered me, going wide. "Better than you think, widow. Ask your husband." "Oh, wait. You can't." I started to step forward, but Michael caught my arm. "He's trying to make you angry," he whispered. "Make you careless." "I know." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "James taught me about that too. Anger makes you quick, but it makes you sloppy." We pressed on more carefully now. The tunnel branched again, but the blood trail was clear. Wade was heading east, toward Miller's Pass. The weapons shipment, I realized. "He's trying to reach it." "Kate." Michael hesitated. "There's more you need to know about that shipment, about why James really died." Before he could continue, a rumble shook the tunnel. Dust and small rocks showered down around us. "That wasn't natural," Michael said. "Wade's not just running," I agreed. "He's leading us somewhere." Another shot, closer this time. "Come on, Mrs. Morrison. Don't you want to know the truth about James, about everything?" "I know the truth." I projected my voice, letting it bounce off the tunnel walls. "James was working against you." Wade's laugh echoed back. "Is that what your friend told you? That James was some noble lawman working undercover? The truth is much more interesting. Stop playing games, Wade." "Games? No, my dear. Your husband was playing games. With you, with me, with everyone. Did you never wonder why he was so insistent on teaching you everything he knew?" I moved forward carefully, using the sound of his voice to track his position. He was protecting me. Protecting you or preparing you? Ask yourself, why would a simple gunsmith have contacts in every fort from here to Fort Laramie? Why would he know military patrol schedules, ammunition supplies, troop movements? "He was gathering evidence against you," I insisted. But doubt crept in. There had been so many things James hadn't explained. Evidence? Wade barked out another laugh, closer now. Oh, he gathered evidence all right, evidence that made him valuable to everyone, to me, to the marshal's office, to the army, to the tribes. Your husband, Mrs. Morrison, was the territory's most successful double agent, maybe a triple agent. Honestly, I'm not sure even he knew whose side he was really on by the end. Michael grabbed my shoulder, trying to pull me back, but I shrugged him off. You're lying. Am I? Think about it. The perfect cover, a respected gunsmith in a growing town, someone everyone trusted, everyone talked to. The kind of man who could sell weapons to settlers and tribes alike, who could pass information in both directions, who could play every side against the middle. Another rumble shook the tunnel, stronger this time. Support beams groaned ominously. He's going to bring it down, Michael warned. Not yet, Wade called out, hearing him. Not until Mrs. Morrison learns the truth about her beloved James, about why he really had to die. I could see his lamp now, flickering around a bend in the tunnel. Then tell me! He didn't die because he was working against me. He died because he tried to stop playing the game entirely, said he wanted out, wanted to come clean, wanted to do the right thing, as if any of us knew what that meant anymore. The weapons. Shipment, Michael said suddenly. The one coming through Miller's Pass. It wasn't just guns for the tribes, was it? Very good, young man. No, not just guns. Information, papers, proof of everything, every deal, every betrayal, every secret operation from here to Washington. James helped gather it all, playing every side, collecting evidence against everyone. He was going to expose it all, bring down the whole corrupt system. And you couldn't let that happen, I said, pieces falling into place. Me, I was just one player, Mrs. Morrison, one piece on the board. The order to kill James came from much higher up, the same people who abandoned him when he asked for help. The same people who are waiting at Miller's Pass right now, making sure that shipment holds all the evidence it's supposed to hold. Another shot rang out, wild and desperate. You want to know who really killed your husband? Get to that shipment. See for yourself who shows up to claim it, but you'd better hurry. My men will be there soon, and they have orders to burn everything. Tunnels shook again, more violently. Rocks and dirt poured down around us. Wade! I shouted over the rumble. This whole section is going to collapse. That's the idea, my dear. Can't have anyone following me out the other exit, can I? But don't worry, I've left you a gift. All of James's real journals, hidden in a strongbox in the shipment. Everything he knew, everything he was planning. It's all there. If you survive to read it. A massive crack split the air. Support beams began to snap. Kate, we have to go! Michael grabbed my arm. Now! I fired 3 quick shots in Wade's direction, forcing him to duck, buying us precious seconds to retreat. We ran as the tunnel began to collapse behind us, timbers giving way with thunderous crashes. We barely made it back to the cellar stairs before the final collapse. Dust billowed out of the tunnel mouth as tons of rock and earth sealed it forever. Wade? Michael asked between coughs. He knew another way out, I said grimly. He's heading for the shipment. We need to get to Miller's Pass. Kate, Michael, caught his breath. What Wade said about James, about different sides giving orders, I know. I checked my remaining ammunition. The marshal's office, the army, Wade's organization. They all wanted him dead for different reasons. And they all have men waiting at that pass. It's a trap. Of course it is. I smiled grimly, but they don't know what James taught me about springing traps. Heavy footsteps above us, reinforcements arriving. We needed to move, get back to the others, I told Michael. Tell them to be ready. I'm going to need help getting into that pass. You're going alone? Wade was right about one thing. James left those journals for me to find. He knew someday I'd need to know everything. I thought of all his lessons, all his preparation. He believed I could finish what he started. Time to prove him right. You're not going alone, Michael insisted. James wouldn't want that. A bitter laugh escaped me. Do we really know what James would want anymore? Everything I thought I knew about him. He loved you. Michael's voice was firm. Whatever else he was doing, whoever he was really working for, that much was true. Anyone could see it. More footsteps above, moving purposefully now, searching. "We need to move," I said. "There's a back exit through the wine cellar. James mentioned it once, said Wade liked to brag about his escape routes." We found the hidden door behind a rack of dusty bottles. It opened into a narrow passage that sloped upward. "This will take us out near the creek," I explained as we hurried through. "Wade's men will be watching the roads, but they don't know all of James's shortcuts through the hills. And you do? Some of them. He used to take me riding in these hills, teaching me landmarks and showing me hidden paths. Said everyone should know more than one way home." I paused, remembering. I thought he was just being protective. Now I wonder if he was leaving me a map I'd need someday. The passage emerged in a small cave above the creek bed. Evening was approaching, painting the hills in shades of gold and purple. "Miller's Pass is an hour's ride," Michael said, surveying the terrain. "Less if we push hard. We're not going straight there." I oriented myself, finding the landmarks James had taught me. "Wade said his men have orders to burn everything. They'll be watching the main approach. You have another way in?" James used to talk about the old hunting trails, said the tribes used them long before the miners came. Most people have forgotten them, but they're still there if you know where to look. A shot rang out from somewhere behind us. Wade's men finding our trail. "Go," I told Michael. "Get back to town. Rally the others. When the shooting starts at the pass, Wade's men in town will be distracted. That's when you move on from his operation." "Kate, James died trying to expose everything alone." I cut him off. "I won't make the same mistake. But this part, this has to be me." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Be careful. Wade's not the only one who'll be waiting up there." "I know. I checked my weapons one last time. The marshal's office, the army, maybe others. They'll all want those journals, that evidence. They'll all have men watching. How will you handle them all?" I smiled grimly. "James taught me more than just shooting. He taught me how people think, how they react. Everyone up there will be watching everyone else, waiting to see who makes the first move. And you." "I'll do what James taught me. Wait for the right moment, then change the rules of the game." We separated at the creek, Michael heading back toward town while I moved into the deepening shadows of the hills. The familiar weight of the revolver at my hip was comforting, but it was James's other lessons that would matter more now. Reading people, understanding motivations, seeing the angles others missed. The hunting trail was right where James had described it, a narrow path hidden by scrub brush, climbing steeply into the hills. As I ascended, I thought about everything Wade had revealed, about James playing all sides, gathering evidence against everyone, about his decision to expose it all, and what that had cost him. Had he known they would kill him for it? Had all those lessons, all that preparation, been his way of ensuring his work wouldn't die with him? A flicker of movement caught my eye. Someone watching the main road into the pass. Through James's old spyglass, I could make out at least 3 different groups taking positions. Wade's men were obvious, heavily armed and watching the road. The others were more subtle, a few men in civilian clothes that didn't quite fit right, military bearing giving them away as army. Others who moved like lawmen, trying not to look like lawmen, and there, moving carefully through the growing darkness, Wade himself, making his way toward where the shipment would arrive. James's voice whispered in my memory. "A good hunter doesn't just watch their prey. They watch who else is watching their prey." I settled into a hidden position above the pass, where I could see everything while remaining unseen. The pieces were all in place. Wade, his men, the army, the marshal's office, all circling each other like wolves around a kill. Soon the shipment would arrive. Soon they would all show their true colors, and then they would learn what else James had taught his widow, someone who could arrange for a troublesome gunsmith to have an accident, someone who was about to learn that James Morrison's widow was a whole new kind of trouble. More shots peppered the cave entrance. I counted at least 5 different shooters, methodically cutting off any escape. They were professionals. No wasted shots, no wild firing. This wasn't a capture mission. They were here to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. James's voice whispered in my memory, "When you're cornered, look for the option everyone else has overlooked." I scanned the cave quickly. The entrance was impossible. They had clear lines of fire. The strongbox was too heavy to run with, but James had chosen this location for a reason. He never did anything without multiple purposes. My eyes caught on a dark crevice behind where Wade had fallen. Air moved through it. I could feel it, disturbing the smoke from the gunfire. "Another exit," I whispered. "Just like James to have. A backup plan." But the strongbox, I pulled James's journals from it first, then grabbed the most damning letters, the ones with official seals and signatures. The rest would have to stay. Hopefully the cave itself would protect them until I could return. "Move in," a voice commanded from outside. "Finish it." I fired 3 quick shots through the entrance, buying seconds. The crevice was tight, designed to be overlooked, just as James would have wanted. I squeezed through just as they breached the cave. "Search everything. Find those documents." "Sir, Wade's dead, but there's blood here. Someone else was wounded. Follow it. No witnesses." The passage twisted upward, forcing me to climb. My shoulder screamed where Bolton's bullet had grazed. It earlier, but I pushed through the pain. James's lessons about survival rang in my head. Pain is information. Use it to stay alive, but don't let it slow you down. The passage emerged high above the pass, opening onto a narrow ledge. Below, I could see the wagons had stopped. Men swarmed around them, some in army uniforms, others in civilian clothes, all of them looking the wrong way. A shot sparked off the rock near my head. One of them had spotted me. "There! On the ridge!" I ran, staying low, using the terrain like James had taught me. More shots followed, but the angle was bad for them. I had the high ground, just like James always preferred. "The journal survived," a calm voice carried up from below. "But some papers are missing. Search her property. Search the whole town if you have to." That voice, I knew it, had heard it before at James's funeral. A distinguished-looking man who'd offered condolences, who'd spoken highly of James's service to his country, the same man whose signature was on one of the letters I'd taken. Pieces clicked into place. The weapons shipment, the planned uprising, Wade's operation. They were all part of something bigger, a way to justify military expansion, to seize tribal lands, to control the territory's development. And James had proof of all of it. More. Shots forced me to move. Below, I heard horses being mounted, orders being given. They'd be coming up after me, and they knew these hills too, but not as well as I did, not as well as James had known them. I worked my way along the ridge, reading the terrain like James had taught me. There was a place ahead, a box canyon, that looked like a trap, but actually led to a hidden trail down the other side. James had shown it to me once, making sure I understood its value. "Sometimes," he'd said, "the best escape route looks like certain death to everyone else." Hooves thundered below as they split up to cover the possible paths down the ridge. They were professionals, moving to cut off all obvious escape routes. But James hadn't taught me to be obvious. I reached the canyon just as moonlight broke through the clouds. For a moment, I paused to check the letters I'd taken. The one on top bore a familiar seal, the Department of War. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man who'd spoken at my husband's funeral, who'd promised justice would be done, who'd helped cover up his own order to have James killed. More horses approached. They'd figure out where I was soon enough. Time to move. I cached the documents carefully in a spot James had shown me. A hollow tree that had served as a marker for tribal hunters long before silver brought miners to these hills. The journals I kept, They'd be looking for those, expecting them to contain the evidence they feared. "Let them chase me while the real proof waited here, safely hidden," a voice called out, closer now. The same voice from James's funeral. Mrs. Morrison. Night settled over Miller's Pass like a thick blanket, bringing with it a silence that made every snapped twig and shuffled foot echo through the rocks. From my hidden position, I watched the various players move into place, each group thinking they were the hunters, none realizing they were all prey to someone else's plans. Wade's men had taken positions along the high ground, their rifles glinting. Occasionally in the moonlight, the army men, 3 of them trying to look like ordinary travelers, had scattered themselves near the road. 2 more groups lurked in the shadows, Marshall's deputies, I guessed, though their badges were carefully hidden. Through my spyglass, I caught glimpses of Wade himself, moving between the rocks with surprising agility, despite his injured arm. He was heading toward a specific spot, a narrow cave opening, half hidden by brush. Something about the way he moved told me he'd been here before. James's voice echoed in my memory. People always return to what they know. In a crisis, they'll run to familiar ground. The sound of approaching wagons drifted up from the valley. Right on schedule. 3 wagons, moving slowly in the darkness, each driven by men who looked like ordinary teamsters but sat just a little too straight, handled their reins with just a little too much precision. Military men, playing at being. Civilians. The wagons entered the pass, wheels creaking in the silence. Everyone tensed, waiting to see who would make the first move. This was the moment when the shipment was vulnerable, when everyone's attention would be focused on the cargo. A shot rang out, and for a moment I thought someone had jumped the gun. But no. This came from the direction of Silver Creek. The signal we'd arranged. Michael and the others were moving on Wade's operation in town. The shot had an immediate effect on the men in the pass. Wade's group looked toward town, suddenly uncertain. The army men shifted, wondering if they should abandon their cover story. The marshal's deputies began moving, using the distraction to get closer to the wagons. Another shot from town, then another. Wade's men started looking to their boss for guidance, but Wade himself had disappeared into the cave. I smiled grimly. James had taught me to recognize opportunities, and this was one he'd practically gift-wrapped. While everyone's attention was divided between the wagons and the sounds from town, I moved. The cave entrance was easier to reach than it looked if you knew where to step. Wade had left signs of his passage, scuffed rocks, disturbed gravel. He was in a hurry now, desperate to reach whatever was hidden here. Inside, the cave opened into a larger space. Lantern light flickered against the walls, and I could hear Wade muttering to himself as he searched for something, looking for these. I stepped into view, James's old revolver steady in my hand. Wade spun, his own gun rising. "Mrs. Morrison, I should have known you'd find this place. James showed it to me once, said it was an old smuggler's cache from the mining days." I kept my voice calm, remembering James's lessons about controlling situations through confidence. He also mentioned a strongbox. "Clever man, your husband." Wade's eyes darted to a dark corner where a metal box sat half hidden behind rocks. "Did he tell you what was in it?" "Why don't you tell me? Would you believe me if I did?" "A fair question." I gestured with my gun. "Open it." "You're making a mistake," Wade said, but he moved toward the box. "Some secrets are better left buried." Like the secret of who really wanted James dead. The army, the marshal's office, your organization, you all had reasons. But someone gave the actual order. Wade's hands worked at the box's lock. "You really want to know? Because once you do, you can never go back. Never pretend you don't know how deep the corruption goes, how high up it reaches." The lock clicked open. "Show me," I ordered. Wade lifted the lid slowly. Inside, I could see leather-bound journals, James's distinctive handwriting visible on their spines. But there was something else, something that made Wade's breath catch. "Well," he said softly. "James, you clever bastard. What is it? See for yourself." Wade stepped back, hands raised. "But remember, I tried to warn you." I moved closer, keeping my gun trained on him. The journals were there, yes, but beneath them lay a stack of letters on official stationery, military headers, government seals, signatures of men whose names I'd seen in newspapers. Orders, Wade explained. Authorizations, proof of who was really controlling everything. The weapons trades, the tribal conflicts, the territory's development. Your husband didn't just gather evidence against criminals like me. He documented every deal, every decision, every secret order that came down from a shot cracked through the cave. Wade staggered, a look of genuine surprise crossing his face. Blood spread across his chest. I dove for cover as more shots followed. Through the cave entrance, I caught glimpses of uniforms, army uniforms, not the civilian disguises from earlier. "Seal the cave!" someone shouted. "No one gets those documents!" Wade slumped against the wall, laughing despite the blood. "You..." See, they were waiting, watching me lead them to it. "Who?" I demanded, returning fire through the entrance. "Who gave the order?" "The same ones who ordered James killed. The ones who..." He coughed, red staining his lips. "Who really runs things. The ones who..." Another shot caught him in the throat. He slid down, eyes already glazing. I had seconds before they rushed to the cave. The strongbox was too heavy to carry, too important to leave. James had died protecting this evidence, died trying to expose. The answer hit me with stunning clarity. The army uniforms outside weren't from the local fort. They were too new, too clean. These men had come from much further away, sent by someone with enough authority to order a cover-up across 3 territories. Someone who could order a U.S. Marshal to abandon his undercover agent. Someone who could arrange for a troublesome gunsmith to have an accident. Someone who was about to learn that James Morrison's widow was a whole new kind of trouble. The night. Air carried sounds of pursuit from all directions. Hoofbeats, voices, the metallic click of weapons being checked. In the moonlight, I could see riders converging on the canyon, their uniforms stark against the darkness. They moved with military precision, coordinating their approach like men who'd done this many times before. How many other accidents had they arranged? How many other inconvenient truths had they buried in these hills? The canyon ends in a sheer drop. The commander's voice carried clearly. "She has nowhere to go. Move in carefully. We want those documents intact." James's voice whispered in my memory. "When everyone expects you to do something desperate, do something smart instead." I fired 2 shots into the air, making sure they saw my position at the canyon's edge. Let them think I was panicking, wasting ammunition. Below and behind me I heard them dismounting, preparing to approach on foot. They'd want to take their time, do this carefully. After all, they thought I was trapped. The commander's voice again, closer now. "Mrs. Morrison!" "Be reasonable. By now you've read enough to understand what's at stake. Think about what your husband would want." "My husband wanted the truth exposed," I called back, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "About the weapons, about the planned uprising, about all of it. The truth," he laughed, "but there was an edge to it. Your husband was collecting evidence against everyone, playing all sides. He was going to destroy everything we've built, destabilize the entire territory." "You mean he was going to expose how you've been arming both sides, creating conflicts to justify military expansion?" A pause. When he spoke again, his voice was harder. "Your husband understood the necessity of our work, Mrs. Morrison. He helped us for years. It was only at the end that he lost his nerve, started talking about morality and conscience." I moved carefully along the canyon edge, using their focus, on my voice to mask my real movements. James had shown me how the rock formations created echoes, how to use them to confuse pursuit. "Is that why you had him killed? Because he found his conscience?" James Morrison was a patriot who died serving his country's interests. Don't dishonor his memory by turning his work into some kind of cheap scandal. The hollow tree with the D. Hidden documents was behind me now. Time to move. You're right about one thing, I called out. James was a patriot. That's why he gathered proof of everything. The weapons deals, the staged incidents, the orders coming down from Washington. He knew someday someone would need to expose the truth. And now you think you'll finish what he started? Real anger in his voice now. You're just a widow playing with things you don't understand. Your husband spent years building the contacts, the relationships, the trust, the perfect cover. I cut him off. The respected gunsmith, the trusted businessman, everyone's friend, everyone's confidant, close enough to gather evidence against all of you. Movement to my left, they were trying to flank me. But that was fine. Let them focus on the canyon's edge. If you've read his journals, the commander said, then you know the reality. The territory needs stability. The tribes need to be contained. Development needs to be controlled. We're building a nation here, Mrs. Morrison. That requires difficult choices. Choices like murdering an honest man, like staging conflicts to steal land, like arming killers to justify military rule. Enough! The edge in his voice told me I'd struck a nerve. You have nowhere to go. Surrender now and we can discuss terms. Fight and... A shot punctuated his words, chipping rock near my head. A warning. I smiled in the darkness. James had taught me to read people, to understand their motivations. The commander's words revealed more than he knew. He wasn't sure exactly what proof I had, what documents I'd taken. He needed to know. Time to change the game. I fired again, this time at the loose rocks near the canyon's edge. The report echoed off the walls as stones clattered down into the darkness. "Hold your fire!" the commander ordered. "We need those documents." Another shot, more falling rocks. They'd be thinking I was growing desperate, maybe planning to destroy the evidence. "Good. Last chance, Mrs. Morrison. You have 10 seconds to surrender." I fired twice more, quickening the pace, making it sound panicked. More rocks fell. 5 seconds. The hidden trail was right where James had shown me, a narrow ledge invisible from above, switching back down the canyon's far side. But they didn't need to know that yet. 3. I fired my last shot, targeting a specific cluster of rocks. The cascade was immediate and dramatic, a whole section of the canyon's edge seeming to give way. In the moonlight, it would look like I'd fallen with it. "No!" The commander's shout was almost genuine. "Hold position. Wait for first light before attempting recovery. The documents could have survived the fall." Perfect. They'd waste hours searching. The canyon bottom, expecting to find broken remains and scattered papers. By then, I'd be long gone. "Sir!" A new voice, urgent. "Riders approaching from Silver Creek. Multiple signals. Looks like Wade's men are under attack," the commander cursed. "Mitchell, take 6 men and check the canyon floor at first light. The rest of you back to town. Whatever's happening there, we can't let it expose the operation." Hoofbeats retreated into the night. They'd left guards, of course, but they'd be watching the canyon floor, not the hidden trail I was already descending. James had taught me that survival sometimes meant letting your enemies think they'd won. Let them search the canyon. Let them respond to whatever Michael and the others were doing in town. They'd realized too late that the most damaging documents were already safely hidden, waiting to be recovered when the time was right. The hidden trail was treacherous in the dark, but James had made me memorize every turn, every handhold. Even now, a year after his death, he was still protecting me, still teaching me, still helping me expose the truth. Dawn was approaching by the time I reached the valley floor. In the growing light, I could see smoke rising from Silver Creek, Michael and the others keeping Wade's men busy, drawing attention from my escape. But this was bigger than Wade now. The documents I'd hidden proved that. Letters bearing the seals of the War Department, the Territorial Governor's Office, even Congress. Orders authorizing actions that would never survive public scrutiny. Proof of how a few powerful men were. shaping the territory's future through violence and manipulation. James had died trying to expose it all. They thought killing him would bury the truth, but they'd forgotten something important. They'd left his widow alive, and I had one advantage they couldn't match. I knew exactly how James thought, how he planned, how he prepared. Every lesson he'd taught me, every skill he'd insisted I learn, every secret he'd shared, it was all for this moment. The sound of horses approaching pulled me from my thoughts. Multiple riders, moving fast but trying to stay quiet. Not the army men, their horses would be tired from the night's pursuit. Not Wade's men, they'd be busy in town. That left one possibility. "Mrs. Morrison?" A familiar voice called softly. "It's Thomas Wright. Michael sent us. Said you might need help getting clear." I stayed hidden, watching. 5 riders, including Thomas and his wife Mary. Good people who'd helped me before, but James had taught me to be cautious. "The telegram office," I called back. "What did James always say about it? That it was the best place in town to learn secrets," Thomas replied. "Because everyone trusts the operator to be discreet." I emerged from my hiding place. They were leading a spare horse, my own mount from the stable, I realized. They'd thought of everything. "Michael has Wade's men occupied in town," Mary explained as I mounted. "But there's talk of army patrols coming from Fort Harrison. We need to move quickly." I nodded, but my mind was already racing ahead. The hidden documents would be safe for. Now, James had chosen that location carefully, used it for years without discovery. The army would waste time searching the canyon, then trying to contain whatever was happening in town. That gave us a window of opportunity. Time to reach out to James's other contacts, the ones he'd trusted enough to mention in his journals. Time to piece together everything he'd uncovered about the conspiracy reaching from Silver Creek all the way to Washington. "Where are we headed?" Thomas asked as we rode. I thought of James's lessons about strategy, about playing the long game. "First, we find somewhere safe to examine what I recovered. Then we start reaching out to people James trusted, newspaper editors, honest lawmen, territorial judges, people who can help expose the truth." "They'll come after us," Mary warned. "Men like that, with that kind of power, let them come." I patted the revolver James had given me, not truth teller, which I'd lost in the cave, but its twin, equally reliable. My husband spent years preparing for this moment, teaching me everything I'd need to know. It's time they learned what else he taught his widow. We rode hard through the pre-dawn light, taking the back trails James had shown me. Every so often we'd hear distant hoofbeats or see the flicker of lanterns, but we stayed ahead of pursuit. "There's something you should know," Thomas said as we paused to rest the horses. "Before all this started, James gave me a package. Said if anything happened to him, I should hold it until you came asking the right questions." My heart skipped. "What kind of package?" "More documents, letters, names of people we can trust, and people we can't." He knew Kate. He knew they might kill him, so he spread the evidence out. Made sure no one person had all the pieces. "Smart," Mary commented. "They couldn't silence everyone at once." "James always thought 3 moves ahead," I agreed, remembering his lessons about strategy. "The documents I grabbed tonight, the ones hidden in the tree, the package he left with you, they're all parts of the bigger picture." Thomas nodded. "He also left instructions about who to contact first. Said there's a newspaper editor in Denver who's been investigating similar corruption in other territories, and a judge in Wyoming who can't be bought. They'll try to stop us." One of the other riders, Cooper, I realized, warned. "They've got men everywhere." "Not everywhere," I said, thinking of James's journals. "There are still honest people in power. James found them, built relationships with them. That's why they killed him, not just because of what he knew, but because of who he could reach with that knowledge." "Speaking of knowledge," Mary cut in, "we should tell her about Sarah." "The school teacher?" I asked, surprised. Thomas nodded. "She's been helping us more than you knew. Her father was a circuit judge before Wade's people arranged his retirement. She's been quietly corresponding with other judges, building a network of people who want to expose the corruption. Another piece of James's puzzle clicked into place. How many others had he prepared? How many threads of resistance had he woven while pretending to work for the very people he was fighting? "The commander," I said slowly. "The one who ordered James killed. He was at the funeral, spoke about James's service to his country." "Colonel Harrison," Thomas supplied. "He's been running the operation from Fort Harrison, using his position to coordinate between Washington and the local players like Wade." "But he's not the top," Mary added. "From what we've pieced together, the orders come from much higher. Someone in the War Department who stands to profit from controlling the territory's development." "Senator Morrison," I breathed, remembering a name from the documents. No relation to James, but he chairs the committee overseeing territorial expansion. His signature was on some of the orders I found. A twig snapped in the darkness. We all froze. "Riders approaching," Cooper whispered. "From the north." "Army patrol," Thomas agreed, listening. "They're searching systematically." I thought quickly. "We need to split up. They'll be looking for a group." "Kate," Mary started to protest. "Thomas, you and Mary head for Denver. Contact that newspaper editor. Cooper, take the others south toward Wyoming. Find that judge." "What about you?" I smiled grimly. "I'm going to Fort Harrison." "That's suicide," Cooper protested. "It's their headquarters." "It's the last place they'll expect me to go," I countered. And James had friends there, soldiers who knew what was happening but couldn't speak up. The journals mentioned them by name. "At least take someone with you," Mary pleaded. I shook my head. "One person can move more quietly than two. Besides, I need you all working from other angles. If something happens to me, the evidence needs to reach the right people." The approaching horses were closer now. No more time to argue. 2 weeks, I said quickly. "If you don't hear from me by then, release everything. The documents Thomas has, the ones hidden in the tree, all of it. Send copies to every newspaper and honest judge you can find." They nodded, understanding. James had taught me the value of deadlines, of forcing action before the opposition could properly prepare. We separated quickly, each taking different trails into the darkness. I headed northwest toward Fort Harrison, while the others split east and south. Behind us, the patrol's lanterns swung through the trees, searching for a group that no longer existed. Dawn was breaking as I reached the ridge overlooking Silver Creek. Smoke still rose from several buildings. The fight there wasn't over. But that works in our favor now, keeping attention focused in the wrong direction. I touched James's journals, secure in my saddlebag. Everything he'd discovered, everyone he'd contacted, every piece of the conspiracy he'd uncovered, it was all here, along with something else, something I hadn't told the others about. A letter written in James's hand, dated the day before he died. "Addressed to me, my dearest Kate," it began. "If you're reading this, then they finally realized how much I really knew. But don't grieve for me. Everything I've done, every lesson I've taught you, every secret I've uncovered, it was all to prepare for this moment. They think killing me will protect their secrets, but they don't understand what they're really facing. They're about to learn that the most dangerous person isn't the one who uncovers the truth. It's the one who knows how to use it." I tucked the letter away as the sun crested the horizon. Time to show them exactly what else James had taught his widow. Fort Harrison loomed against the morning sky, its walls catching the first rays of sunlight. From my hidden position in the tree line, I studied the patterns of the sentries, the timing of the patrols. James's journals had detailed everything about the fort's security, but I needed to see it for myself. Always verify intelligence personally, James had taught me. The best information in the world is useless if it's outdated. The fort's main gate faced east toward Silver Creek. Supply wagons entered regularly, bringing provisions and materials. But James had noted another entrance, a small postern gate on the western wall, used mainly by officers slipping out to visit the nearby town's saloons. According to his journals, one of the gate guards was sympathetic to his cause. Sergeant Daniel Matthews, a career soldier who'd grown disgusted with the corruption he witnessed. James had trusted him enough to name him in his writings, which meant either the man was truly reliable or this was an elaborate trap. Only one way to find out. I approached the western wall shortly before noon, when the sun would be in the sentry's eyes. A lone figure in a sergeant's uniform stood by the small gate, checking supply requisitions. The sun glinted off his name tag, Matthews. Quite a lot of activity in town, I said casually as I approached. The phrase was one James had written down, a recognition signal. Matthews barely glanced up. Trouble follows trouble, he replied, the correct counter-signal. Then very quietly, Mrs. Morrison, he said you might come. James trusted you, still do. Even dead, he's fighting them. Matthews shuffled his papers. Colonel's been in a mood since last night. Something about missing documents. Any unusual orders? Patrols doubled. Everyone is watching for a widow with a gun. He smiled slightly. Nobody watches for a laundress with a basket. He gestured to a covered basket. Near the gate. Inside, I found a plain dress and apron. Laundry detail comes through here in 10 minutes, Matthews explained. New girl started yesterday, won't be coming in today on account of a mysterious bout of illness. I changed quickly behind some bushes. The dress fit well enough. James's? Planning again. He'd known my measurements, known I might need this disguise. Colonel's office is in the headquarters building, Matthews said as I adjusted the apron. Second floor, east side. He's meeting with some officials from Washington this afternoon. Something about containing the situation. How many guards? 2, outside his office, more patrolling the building, but they're looking for threats from outside, not inside. I nodded, settling the empty basket on my hip. If anything happens, I never saw you, Matthews finished. And Mrs. Morrison, he was a good man. What they did to him, it wasn't right. The laundry detail arrived right on schedule. 3 women with baskets, chattering about domestic matters. I fell in with them easily, just another servant doing her daily tasks. Inside the fort, activity was clearly heightened. Soldiers hurried about with purpose. Messengers ran between buildings, and officers gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices. They're all worked up about something, one of the laundresses whispered to me. Haven't seen them this anxious since that business with the gunsmith last year. I kept my face neutral. Oh? You know, the one they said cleaned his gun wrong. Nobody believed that story, mind you. Not with him being so careful about weapons and all. Sarah, another woman hissed, you shouldn't gossip about such things. Why? It's not like they care what we think. To them, we're just furniture, invisible. Invisible. Just like James had planned. The perfect cover for gathering information. Who pays attention to servants doing their jobs? We entered the headquarters building, splitting up to collect laundry from different areas. I took the second floor, naturally. 2 guards stood outside the colonel's office, just as Matthews had said. They barely glanced at me as I worked my way down the hall, collecting laundry bags from each room. Through the office door I could hear voices. The situation is deteriorating. The widow has evidence that could expose everything. Then find her. That was Colonel Harrison's voice. She's one woman. How hard can it be? She's not working alone, a new voice said. Cultured, educated, somehow familiar. Morrison made sure of that. He spent years building a network of allies, spreading evidence among them. If any one of them talks, then silence them all. It's not that simple anymore, Colonel. Morrison was clever. He gave different pieces to different people. Kill one, and the others will release everything they have. We need to find them all. Figure out who knows what, then move carefully. I edged closer to the door, pretending to fuss with my basket. Senator, Harrison said carefully, with all due respect, we're running out of time. If those documents reach the wrong people. Senator Morrison, the same name I'd seen on the orders, the man behind it all. Now I knew why his voice was familiar. I'd heard him speak in town once during a campaign stop. The documents are useless without context, the senator said smoothly. Who'll believe a widow's accusations against respected officials? We just need to manage this carefully. Discredit her, isolate her supporters, then a floorboard creaked under my foot. The voices stopped. Who's out there? Harrison demanded. Just the laundress, sir, one of the guards answered, barely looking at me. A pause. Then the senator's voice, suspicious. Let me see this laundress. No choice now. I knocked politely and entered, keeping my eyes down, my posture submissive. Begging your pardon, sirs, just collecting the washing. I could feel them studying me. Harrison I recognized from the funeral. Silver-haired, military-bearing. The senator was younger than I'd expected, expensively dressed, with keen eyes. That missed nothing. You're new, Harrison said. I know all the staff. Started yesterday, sir, replacing Mary, who took ill. Mary. The senator's eyes narrowed. The laundress here is named Susan. I was already moving as they reached for their weapons. The basket flew into Harrison's face as I dove behind his heavy desk. Guns roared, wood splintered. Get her! The senator shouted. Those documents must not leave this fort. I drew James's revolver from beneath my skirt, returning fire through the desk. One guard went down, the other ducked back through the door. Calling for help. Harrison was cursing, trying to untangle himself from the laundry. The senator had taken cover behind a filing cabinet. Mrs. Morrison, he called out, let's be reasonable. You're trapped in a fort full of soldiers, but we can still resolve this peacefully. Like you resolved things with James? Your husband made his choice. He knew the consequences of betrayal. Betrayal? I laughed bitterly. He was trying to stop you from starting a war, from using people's lives as pawns in your power games. Progress requires sacrifice, the senator said calmly. The territory needs development, civilization. The tribes need to be contained. If some blood must be shed to achieve that, save your speeches. I cut him off. I've read the documents. This isn't about progress or civilization. It's about money. Your money invested in land you knew would be valuable once the tribes were gone. In businesses that would profit from military contracts. More boots in the hallway. Reinforcements arriving. Time was running out. But James had planned for this too. The journals mentioned something else about the colonel's office, something that explained why he'd chosen it as his headquarters. Give it up, Mrs. Morrison. Harrison had untangled himself, was moving to flank me. You have nowhere to go. I smiled, remembering James's detailed notes. The fort had been built over an old mining operation. Most of the tunnels had been sealed, but one remained. Hidden beneath the headquarters building, the colonel's office had been chosen specifically because it allowed quick escape if the fort was ever attacked. What's so amusing? The senator demanded. You find your situation funny? I'm thinking about something James wrote, I replied, keeping them talking while I located the specific floorboard James had marked in his journals. About how men like you are so focused on looking strong, you never notice your own weaknesses. Philosophical. To the end, Harrison sneered. Just like your husband. More soldiers in the hallway now. I could hear them preparing to breach the door. You know what else James wrote? I shifted position slightly, getting ready. That the best trap is one your enemy walks into willingly. Enough! The senator's patience snapped. Harrison! Finish. This! The colonel stepped out, gun raised. At that exact moment I fired, not at them but at the floorboard near the window. The ancient wood splintered, revealing the hidden tunnel entrance beneath. The surprise on their faces was almost worth everything it had taken to get here. That's impossible, Harrison breathed. No one knew about— James knew. I cut him off. James knew everything, about the tunnel, about the weapons deals, about how you and the senator were using military contracts to get rich off other people's suffering. Kill her! The senator roared. I fired again, forcing them back to cover. Then I did something they didn't expect. I shot out the window behind them. The glass shattered outward with a crash. Instantly, shouts of alarm rose from the fort yard below. Guards would be rushing to investigate, thinking someone might have escaped that way. "After her!" Harrison ordered as I dropped into the tunnel. "She must not escape!" The tunnel was exactly as James had described, narrow, sloping downward, branching in 3 directions. In the darkness, I could hear them following, cursing, as they tried to navigate the low ceiling. "Split up!" the senator commanded. "Find her!" I moved quickly but quietly, counting steps just as James's journal had instructed. 50 paces, then right. 30 more, then left. The tunnel here was older, partially collapsed, but still passable. Behind me, voices echoed in confusion. "It's a maze down here. Watch for side passages! Don't let her double back!" James had spent months mapping these tunnels, learning every turn, every dead end. The journal contained detailed drawings, measurements, notes about which passages were stable and which might, collapse. "She's trapped!" Harrison's voice carried clearly. "These tunnels are sealed. There's no way out." "That's what you think," I whispered, reaching the spot James had marked with a simple X in his diagrams. Here, the tunnel seemed to end in a cave-in. But James had discovered something else, a narrow gap, hidden behind fallen rocks, leading to the surface. More voices are approaching. They were coordinating now, trying to search systematically. But they didn't have James's maps, and didn't know what he'd discovered during his careful exploration. I squeezed through the gap, just as lantern light appeared around the corner. Outside, I emerged into bright sunlight in a small ravine well, beyond the fort's walls. But I wasn't done yet. James's final notes had included one more detail: the tunnel's weakness. Years of mining had left them unstable. The right pressure in the right place. I drew the small package of dynamite Matthews had slipped into the laundry basket. Another of James's preparations placed years ago, waiting for this moment. The explosion would seal the tunnels, trapping them below long enough for me to get clear. By the time they dug themselves out, I'd be gone. More importantly, they'd know. Know that James had outplayed them even in death. Know that his widow was more than just a gunsmith's wife seeking revenge. As I lit the fuse and moved quickly away, I thought about James's last letter, about all his preparations, all his lessons. "They think killing me will protect their secrets," he'd written, "but they don't understand what they're really facing." The explosion rumbled through the ground like distant thunder. From the fort came shouts of alarm, confusion, time to move. Thomas and Mary would be reaching Denver soon. Cooper and the others would be contacting the judge in Wyoming. All the pieces James had arranged were finally moving into place. The senator and colonel would survive the cave-in, I knew. But they'd be rattled, uncertain. They'd know their secrets weren't safe, that evidence of their crimes was spreading beyond their control. Most importantly, they'd know that James Morrison's widow was still out there, still holding their fate in her hands, and this was just the beginning. The mountains welcomed me back, like old friends, their shadows offering shelter as I rode hard. Away from Fort Harrison. Behind me, the fortress was in chaos, bells ringing, men shouting, horses thundering out in multiple directions. But James had taught me how to disappear in this country, how to use terrain to break pursuit. The best escape route, he'd always said, is the one that looks impossible to everyone else. I guided my horse up a nearly vertical trail, one the army patrols would dismiss as too dangerous. James had shown me this path once, made me practice it until I could ride it confidently, even in poor light. Now I understand why. By midday, I'd reached the rendezvous point James had marked in his journal, a hidden valley high in the mountains, with good water and plenty of grazing for horses. More importantly, It had clear views of all approaching trails. Sarah Cooper was waiting there, just as we'd arranged through the network of allies James had built. "I was starting to worry," she said, helping me dismount. "When we heard the explosion, all part of the plan," I assured her. "James's plan, as it turns out. He'd prepared everything, years in advance." "That sounds like him." She handed me a canteen. "News from town. Wade's men are in complete disarray. Michael and the others hit 3 of their main operations simultaneously. But that's not the important part." "What is?" "While everyone was distracted by the fighting, I got into Wade's office. Found something interesting in his safe." She pulled out a leather portfolio. Letters between him and Senator Morrison, dating back 5 years, before he even came to Silver Creek. I took the portfolio, scanning quickly. This proves the senator was involved from the beginning. That the whole thing, Wade's operation, the weapons deals, everything, was part of their plan to control the territory's development. "There's more." Sarah's voice turned grim. "One of the letters mentions a meeting, 5 years ago, in Denver, between the senator, Wade, and James," I finished, seeing the name. "He was there at the beginning. Kate." Sarah hesitated. "The letter suggests he was more than just there. He was helping them plan it." The world seemed to tilt. Sideways. I sat heavily on a nearby rock, trying to make sense of it. That's impossible. James was working against them. The journals, the evidence he gathered. "Maybe that's why he gathered it," Sarah suggested gently. "Because he knew everything from the inside, because he'd helped create it." I thought of James's final letter to me, of all his preparations. Had those been driven by guilt, by a desire to make right what he'd helped build? "There's something else," Sarah continued. "A name I recognized. The judge they said was handling James's estate. He's mentioned in these letters too. He's been working with them from the start." "Which means the estate settlement was a fraud," I realized. "They've been trying to force me to sell the shop, to get me out of Silver Creek because the shop was more than just a business," a new voice said. We both spun, guns drawing automatically. A man stepped out of the trees, hands raised. He was older, weathered, with eyes that had seen too much. "Marshal Daniel Cooper," he introduced himself. "The real one, not the man who's been pretending to be me in Silver Creek." Sarah's gun didn't waver. "Prove it," he smiled slightly. "Your father was Judge Cooper before they forced him out. And you, Mrs. Morrison. James recruited you for this fight long before you knew you were in it." "What are you talking about?" "The shop wasn't just a gunsmith's business. It was a waypoint, a place where information could be gathered, where certain weapons could be quietly redirected, where people fighting corruption could find help." I thought of all the visitors James had entertained, all the private conversations in the workshop, all the special orders he'd handled personally. "James built the network," Marshal Cooper continued, "found people who couldn't be bought, who wanted to fight back, but he knew they'd kill him eventually. That's why he trained you, not just in shooting, but in reading people, in understanding motivations, in seeing the bigger picture. You're saying he was preparing me all those years? He knew you had the strength for it, the intelligence, the determination. He just had to teach you the skills. But these letters," I held up the portfolio, "they suggest he helped plan all this, the corruption, the violence." "He did," Cooper acknowledged, "because he knew the only way to expose it was from the inside, to let them think he was one of them while he gathered evidence and built a network to bring them down." A twig snapped somewhere in the trees. We all tensed. "We need to move," Cooper said urgently. "They'll have patrols searching these mountains. Soon. There's a safe house." "No," I cut him off. "We're done hiding. James spent years building this network, gathering evidence, and preparing for this moment. It's time we used it." "What are you suggesting?" I thought of James's journals, of all his careful preparations. "These letters prove the senator's involvement. The documents from Fort Harrison show the military's role. We have evidence of judges being bought, of territories being carved up for profit, of weapons being supplied to start wars. They'll try to discredit it, Sarah warned. Say the documents are forged, that we're lying. Let them try. I stood, decision made. James didn't just gather evidence. He gathered allies, newspaper editors who will print the truth, honest judges who will issue warrants, military officers who are tired of seeing their men die for someone else's profit. It's risky, Cooper said. Once we start, there's no going back. They'll come at us with everything they have. Good. I checked my weapon, thinking of James's lessons about timing and opportunity. Because we're going to come at them with everything. We have to. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every ally James prepared, all at once. They'll expect us to move carefully, Sarah realized, catching on, to test the waters, to move slowly. Which is exactly why we'll do the opposite. I finished. James taught me that sometimes the best strategy is to change the rules of the game entirely. Cooper studied me for a long moment, then nodded. What do you need? How many marshals can you trust? Men who will serve warrants even on powerful people? Enough. Been building my own network, same as James. Good. Sarah, can you get messages? To the others? Thomas and Mary in Denver, Cooper and his group heading to Wyoming? Already arranged. We can coordinate the timing. Then here's what we're going to do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.